"She'll wear your ring now," the Duke said, and his fingers closed around Lady Constance Ashworth's hand before the entire assembled hall, and he pulled the sapphire from her knuckle so hard that she cried out, and if you have ever watched a woman's whole fortune come undone in a single breath, you already know the silence that followed. Before we tell you how a seamstress with flour still under her nails came to stand in that ballroom and name, in front of 300 witnesses, exactly whose child the Duke's mistress carried, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface, hit subscribe. Because what happens next will make you believe it twice. Now walk back with us to a colder house, a smaller room, and a girl who owned nothing but a needle and her father's good name. Marianne Hale had been raised to expect silk, and she had learned in the space of 11 months to be grateful for wool. Her father, Thaddeus Hale, had been a modest gentleman of trade, a man who dealt honestly in linens and ledgers and had, until the spring he died, kept his daughter in the kind of comfortable obscurity that asks nothing of a girl but that she play the pianoforte adequately and marry well eventually. His heart failed him on a Tuesday in October, quietly in his study, over an account book that would later be found to contain entries no one could quite explain, sums paid out to a solicitor named Julian Thorne. Sums that had, in the 6 months before Thaddeus Hale's death, quietly emptied the modest fortune his daughter should have inherited. By the time the lawyers had finished with what remained, Marianne owned a trunk of dresses too fine for her new circumstances, a mother's pearl comb, and nothing else in the world. She went, as such girls so often did, to work. The Ashworth household took her in as a seamstress, more from a sense of performance than of charity. Lady Beatrice Ashworth liked to be seen extending kindness to a ruined gentleman's daughter. Liked the way it made her own consequence gleam a little brighter at the assembly rooms, and so Marianne found herself, within the year, kneeling on the cold floor of an upstairs dressing-room with pins between her lips, taking in the waist of a gown that Lady Constance Ashworth, only child of the house and heiress to what remained of its fading grandeur, would wear to catch a duke. Constance was not unhandsome. She had her mother's fine bones and a great deal of her mother's appetite for admiration. And she had spent the whole of that autumn in a state of barely restrained triumph. Because the Duke of Rothermere, young, unmarried, possessed of an estate so vast that men spoke of it the way they spoke of weather, an event, a condition of the landscape, had begun, according to every drawing-room whisper in the county, to take notice of her. Marianne heard the name Rothermere the way she heard the names of comets and coronations, something enormous, something that had nothing to do with her. "Mind the pins, girl," Constance said now. Turning before the glass, "You've gone and caught the hem crooked." "I beg your pardon, my lady." Marianne had not caught the hem crooked. She said nothing further, because saying nothing further was, by then, a skill she had perfected as thoroughly as any stitch. She had learned that a girl who answers back is a girl who is dismissed, and a girl who is dismissed in November with no family and no fortune does not eat in December. It was Lady Beatrice, sweeping into the room in a cloud of orris powder, who delivered the news that would, though none of them yet knew it, begin to unmake everything. "He dines with us Thursday," she announced, meaning the Duke, meaning it the way a general might announce the arrival of a long-besieged relief column. "Constance, you will wear the blue, not the grey, The grey makes you look consumptive, and dukes do not marry consumptive girls. They marry healthy ones who will give them sons. She looked at Marianne as though noticing a chair. You see that the blue is ready by Wednesday evening, and mind you do a proper job of the sleeves this time. Marianne bent her head over the fabric and said, "Yes, my lady," and if there was anything else moving beneath the flat obedience of her voice, grief or hunger, or the particular loneliness of being spoken over in a room she was required to occupy without being permitted to exist in it, she had long since learned to keep it below the surface, the way a woman learns to keep a wound below a sleeve. She did not know that Wednesday evening, bent over the blue silk by candlelight, with her fingers cramping and her eyes burning, that within a fortnight she would look into the face of the Duke of Rothermere and not know him at all. Because a duke, it turns out, does not always announce himself at the front door with his title stitched into his coat. Sometimes he arrives by the servants' gate, on foot in the rain, having lost his horse to a thrown shoe 3 miles back, asking nothing more than the loan of a dry coat and a moment's shelter, and sometimes the only person awake to answer him is a seamstress who has not yet learned to fear what kindness might cost her. That is where our story truly begins. Not in the ballroom, not with the ring, but in a kitchen doorway on a wet October night, when a stranger in a ruined coat asked a girl he took for a servant whether she might spare a moment's help, and she, not knowing whom she addressed, simply said yes. The rain had not let up in 3 days, and Rothermere Hall, the great house itself, some 6 miles distant, had begun to feel to its master less like a home than like a very large, very cold obligation. Alaric Vane, 7th Duke of Rothermere, had ridden out that afternoon alone, against the advice of every servant in his employ, because he had reached the particular species of restlessness that afflicts men who have inherited too much too young and been asked their opinion on none of it. His father had died when Alaric was 24, and in the 6 years since. He had learned to distrust nearly everyone who smiled at him, because he had discovered, with the particular bitterness of a man who once believed otherwise, that a title changes the arithmetic of every kindness offered to its holder. Women who had never glanced at him twice as a younger son now found him fascinating. Men who had ignored his opinions now solicited them eagerly. He had grown, without entirely meaning to, into a kind of watchfulness that curdled easily into coldness, and those who did not know him well called him proud, and those who knew him better called him guarded, and both were, in their way, correct. The horse threw its shoe on the lower road, in the dark, in the rain, and Alaric, who could have sent his single attending groom ahead for help and waited in some measure of comfort, instead walked, because walking suited the black humour he had ridden out to shake and had not shaken. He came, by luck more than design, upon the lit windows of the Ashworth house, and being unwilling to present himself at a front door in the state his boots had become, he went round to the kitchen entrance instead, meaning only to ask the direction to the nearest inn. Marianne was still awake, because Marianne was always still awake. The blue silk would not finish itself, and the household did not concern itself with how many candles a seamstress burned so long as the sleeves were done by morning. She heard the knock, expected a stable boy, and opened the door instead upon a tall man soaked through to the skin, hatless, his dark coat plastered to broad shoulders, a graze already purpling along one cheekbone where he had evidently taken a fall he had not mentioned to anyone. "Forgive the hour," he said, and there was nothing in his voice of command, nothing that told her what he was, only tiredness, and a civility that seemed to cost him some effort to produce. "My horse has thrown a shoe on the lower road. I wondered whether I might trouble the house for a dry coat and directions to the nearest inn." She did not think. She simply acted the way she had once acted in her father's house, when kindness had not yet been trained out of her by 3 years of being made to feel it was not hers to offer. "Come in out of the wet, sir, before you catch your death," she said, and drew him into the kitchen, and sat him by the banked fire, and fetched down a plain coat that belonged to the under-butler, because it was the only dry garment she could reach without waking the house, and put a cup of something hot into his hands without asking leave of anyone, because in that moment there was no one to ask. He looked at her over the rim of the cup with an expression she would only understand much later. The specific astonishment of a man who has spent 6 years being managed by everyone he meets, encountering for the first time in longer than he could readily say. Someone who had simply been kind to him without first calculating what the kindness might purchase. "You do not know who I am," he said. Not quite a question. "No, sir," she admitted, "only that you are wet through and like to take a chill, and that is enough to be going on with." She busied herself banking the fire higher, unwilling to meet his eyes for reasons she could not have named, and did not see the way he watched her, turning the strangeness of the moment over as a man turns over a coin he suspects, joyfully, might be counterfeit gold. He gave his name, when she finally asked it plainly, without ornament, as Alaric Vane, and let her believe, because she assumed it, and he did not correct her, that he was some gentleman of moderate means fallen on wet luck. She told him her own name in return, and something of her circumstance, the way one tells small true things to a stranger one does not expect to see again. And he listened with an attention that surprised her, asking after her father's trade, after the mathematics she had once been taught, after what she now did with her days, and she found herself talking to him for the better part of an hour before the rain eased enough for him to walk on toward the inn. The borrowed coat over his ruined one, a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the plain, unpurchased fact of her attention. He did not tell her before he left that he was the very Duke whose dinner engagement the household upstairs was, at that moment, rearranging its entire autumn to secure. He told himself, walking the last mile to the inn in coat that was not his own, that he had simply not found the moment to correct her error, but the truth, which he was not yet honest enough with himself to name, was that he had liked, more than he had liked anything in 6 years, being looked at without being seen through. He returned the borrowed coat 3 days later, in his own carriage, with his own name on his own card, and by then the whole house knew precisely who had dined among them, and precisely whose attentions Constance Ashworth had spent an entire evening in blue silk attempting to secure, and Marianne Hale, mending a torn hem in the sewing-room above, heard the carriage wheels on the gravel, and did not, for a long moment, connect the visitor below with the wet stranger from the kitchen door, until she heard, faintly through the floor, the housekeeper below saying the words His Grace, the Duke of Rothermere, and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, because she understood, all at once, precisely how far beneath a duke as seamstress stood, and precisely how foolish she had been to enjoy, even for an hour, the particular warmth of being listened to. He found her again before the week was out, not by grand design, but because Rothermere had discovered, to his own private astonishment that he was inventing reasons to call at the Ashworth house more frequently than strict courtship required, and that the reasons he invented had less to do with Constance's blue silk than with the hope of some errand that might take him past the sewing room, or the kitchen stair, or wherever else he might, by accident that was not entirely accident, encounter the girl who had once handed him a cup of something hot and asked nothing of him in return. He found his opening on a Tuesday, when Lady Beatrice, delighted to have secured his lordship for a full afternoon's visit, set the household in a small uproar over refreshments, and left the Duke for one unwatched quarter-hour at loose ends in the drawing-room, where he discovered, by design, he would later admit only to himself, that the seamstress had been sent in to collect a torn glove for mending, and that no one else was present to prevent him from speaking to her plainly. "You knew," he said, without preamble, "and you said nothing when I came again to dinner." Marianne, glove in hand, dropped a curtsy so correct and so cold it was very nearly an accusation in itself. "It was not my place to say anything, Your Grace. It was not your place to be kind to a stranger at your kitchen door either," he said, "and yet you managed that without apparent difficulty." There was something almost pleading beneath the dry humour of it, and she looked up at him then, really looked, and saw not the towering fact of a title, but the same tired, watchful man who had sat by the fire and asked after her father's ledgers as though they mattered. "I did not lie to you," he added, more quietly. "I simply did not correct an assumption I found, for one evening, restful, to live inside. I hope you will not hold that too much against me." She should have curtsied again and left. Instead, she found herself saying, "I am not angry, Your Grace," only surprised that a duke should trouble to remember a seamstress's name. "I have found," he said, "that I remember very little else this past week." And then, as though hearing himself, he coloured slightly and turned the conversation to the safer ground of the mending, and asked whether she might see to a coat of his own that had suffered in the same rain that had ruined the one she'd lent, a transparent excuse, and both of them knew it to be one, and neither of them said so. From that Tuesday, small errands multiplied. A coat requiring a stitch became a waistcoat requiring a button, became a cravat pin that wanted resetting, became, eventually, simply an excuse dispensed with altogether, so that he would linger in whatever room she occupied and speak to her of things he found he could say to no one else. The loneliness of a great house run by servants who watched him for signs of weakness. The exhaustion of being courted by a young woman whose mother did the courting more visibly than the daughter did. The particular grief of losing a father too young to learn from him how a good man carries power without being crushed or corrupted by it. Marianne, in turn, found herself telling him of her own father, of the ledgers she did not understand, and the solicitor who had visited so often in the months before her father's death, of the strange documents that had, in the settling of the estate, left her with nothing when there ought, by her father's own careful accounts, to have been a comfortable sum remaining. A solicitor, Rothermere repeated one afternoon, frowning, what was his name? Thorn, she said. Mr. Julian Thorn. Something crossed the Duke's face then, swift, unreadable, gone before she could name it, and he did not explain it, only asked her a few more careful questions about dates and sums before the conversation turned elsewhere, and she thought no more of it, not knowing that the name Thorn was one he had encountered before in far less innocent company, and that a suspicion had begun that afternoon to take root in him that would not fully flower until it was very nearly too late for all of them. It was Marianne who found the ring, or rather who found the man who had lost it. She had gone down early one morning to return a mended coat before the household woke, and came upon Rothermere in the empty breakfast room, turning something small and gold over and over in his fingers, with an expression of such private grief that she nearly withdrew without speaking. It was a signet ring, heavy, old, the crest worn nearly smooth with age and handling. "My father's," he said, when he saw her looking, and did not seem to mind that she had seen him unguarded. "I do not wear it often. I was afraid this past week that I had lost it." He held it out, unthinking, so that she might see the crest more closely, the Rothermere arms, a hawk rising from a coronet, and it was in that unremarkable moment, turning the heavy little ring in her fingers under the grey morning light, that the full weight of who he was settled on her at last, not as an abstract fact reported by a housekeeper, but as a felt and physical truth. This man, who had eaten her poor cooking and confided his grief and asked after her father's ruin as though it mattered to him personally, commanded an estate that could have swallowed the whole of the Ashworth fortune without noticing the meal. "You look as though I've grown a second head," he said, watching her. "I had simply forgotten, Your Grace." "What you are?" She handed the ring back carefully, as though it might burn her. "I had rather hoped," he said, low, "that you might go on forgetting a while longer." And it was in the silence that followed that they both understood, without either saying it aloud, that whatever this had become between them, it had grown too large to be dismissed any longer as accident. It was also, unbeknownst to either of them, precisely at this juncture that Marianne overheard the conversation that would nearly destroy her. She had gone up the back stair with an armful of linen, meaning only to pass the small parlour that Lady Beatrice kept for private correspondence, and found herself arrested outside the half-open door by the sound of Constance's voice, pitched low and furious, and a second voice, a man's, that she recognized with a jolt as belonging to Mr. Julian Thorne, her father's former solicitor, the very man whose name had made the Duke go so strange and quiet. "He grows cold toward me," Constance was saying, "and you promised me, Julian. You promised me the settlement would be secured before he could look elsewhere." "He will marry you," Thorne answered, with an oiled confidence that turned Marianne's stomach even before she understood its full meaning, "because he will have no choice once matters have progressed a little further. You need only hold your nerve a few weeks more, my dear, and be certain that whatever must be explained is explained in a manner that points toward him and nowhere else." There was a silence, and then Constance's voice again, smaller now, almost frightened beneath its practised hardness. "And if he does not offer for me before it begins to show?" "Then," said Thorne, "we shall simply have to ensure that it is impossible for him to refuse. A duke may survive scandal. He cannot survive being known, publicly, to have ruined an innocent girl and abandoned her. We shall make certain the story tells itself the way we require it to." Marianne stood frozen in the corridor with the linen crushed against her chest, and understood, in the space of that single overheard exchange, three separate and terrible things: that Constance Ashworth was carrying a child that was not the Duke's, that Julian Thorne, the very man who had emptied her own father's estate, was the child's father, and was conspiring to have the ruin laid at Rothermere's door instead, and that whatever affection had grown quietly between herself and the Duke these past weeks was about to be crushed beneath a scandal designed, with cold and deliberate cruelty, to force him into a marriage built entirely on a lie. She did not know, standing in that cold corridor with her heart hammering, that Thorne's schemes reached further back than this single autumn, that the very fraud which had stripped her father's estate bare had been the first rehearsal for the far larger theft he now attempted against a duke, and that in exposing one she would inevitably be forced to expose the other, at a cost to herself that she could not yet begin to calculate. She said nothing that day to anyone. She was, after all, only a seamstress, and a seamstress who accused an heiress of carrying another man's child, with no proof beyond a corridor's overheard whisper, would be believed by no one, and ruined by everyone before the sentence was finished. She went back to her mending with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and began, in the privacy of her own frightened mind, to understand that she would need proof, real proof, the kind that could not be waved away as a jealous servant's fancy, before she dared say a word of what she knew. She did not have long to gather it. The house, and everyone in it, was about to move very much faster than she was prepared for. It was Lady Beatrice who moved first, and moved with the particular ruthlessness of a woman who has sensed correctly that her daughter's prospects are slipping. Within a fortnight of the overheard conversation, Constance had begun to complain, loudly and often, that certain items of her jewellery had gone missing from her dressing table. A bracelet, a small brooch of no great value but sentimental import, and it took very little manoeuvring on Lady Beatrice's part to ensure that suspicion, once raised, settled precisely where Constance and her mother wished it to settle, upon the seamstress who had, of late, been noticed spending rather more time in conversation with the Duke of Rothermere than her station warranted. Marianne was summoned to the drawing-room on a grey Thursday afternoon, and confronted before the assembled household, Lady Beatrice enthroned in her chair, Constance at her shoulder, with an expression of injured innocence so perfectly composed it might have been rehearsed, which, in fact, it had been. "You will empty your pockets," Lady Beatrice said, "and your trunk will be searched before you leave this house tonight." "I have taken nothing, my lady." Marianne's voice did not shake, though everything in her wanted it to. "A girl in your circumstance," Lady Beatrice said, with the particular contempt of a woman enjoying herself, has every reason in the world to help herself to what she cannot otherwise afford. It is only human nature. No one blames you for the impulse. We simply cannot continue to employ you, given the impulse exists. The search, conducted with theatrical thoroughness by the housekeeper under Lady Beatrice's direction, produced nothing, because there was nothing to produce. But Marianne understood, watching Constance's face throughout the ordeal, that the outcome of the search had never been the point. The point had been the accusation itself, loud enough and public enough to ensure that whatever Marianne Hale said from this day forward about anything could be dismissed as the bitterness of a dismissed servant with a grudge and a light-fingered reputation. It was, she realized with cold admiration for its cruelty, a preemptive strike. Constance and her mother, whether or not they knew the full extent of what Marianne had overheard, had sensed a threat and moved to discredit its source before it could be voiced. She was given until morning to remove herself from the house. She spent that night in the small room she had occupied for 3 years, unpacking the little she owned by candlelight, and it was there, past midnight, that a soft knock came at her door, and she opened it to find the housekeeper's elderly aunt, old Nan Pratt, who had served the Ashworth family for 40 years and had watched, with the particular clear eyes of a woman too old to be manoeuvred by anyone, everything that had passed in that house all autumn. "I know what they've done to you, child," Nan said without preamble, letting herself in and closing the door softly behind her, "and I've a fair notion of why, though I'll own I don't have the whole of it. But I've kept my eyes open 40 years in this house, and I've seen Mr. Thorne coming and going at hours no honest solicitor keeps, and I've seen Lady Constance meet him in the orchard when she thinks the house asleep. And if you know something that would set this right, you'd best tell an old woman who has no love left for either of them, and nothing left to lose, by helping you find it." And so, in that small cold room by a single candle, Marianne told her everything. The overheard conversation, the child that was not the Duke's, the scheme to force a marriage on a lie, and Nan Pratt, who had buried 2 husbands and outlived her own bitterness, listened without once looking shocked, and said only when Marianne had finished, "Then we had best find you proof, and find it quickly, because a girl turned out of a house at midnight with nothing but her word against a lady's is a girl the world will not trouble itself to believe." They worked through what remained of that night and the days that followed with the particular desperate efficiency of people who understand they have very little time. Nan, who moved through the house with the invisibility of long service, recovered from beneath a loose floorboard in the housekeeper's old sewing closet, a hiding place Constance had used since girlhood and never thought to abandon. A small bundle of letters in Thorne's own hand, unwise enough in their intimacy and their scheming both to leave no doubt whatever of the relationship between them or the plan they had laid. Marianne, for her part, went to the one person she could think of who might confirm the older fraud, the fraud against her own father's estate, and found, in the dusty offices of the elderly clerk who had once assisted Thorne and had since been quietly dismissed and never fully paid for his silence, a man aggrieved enough at his own treatment to produce, for a promise of fair compensation once matters were settled, copies of the falsified accounts that showed precisely how Thaddeus Hale's modest fortune had been diverted over 18 months into accounts controlled by Julian Thorne. And there was one thing more, the most delicate proof of all, and the one Marianne was most reluctant to seek, because it required trading on a kindness she feared she had no right to ask. She went, on the 4th night, to the town's one respectable physician, a Dr. Aldous Fenn, who had attended the Ashworth household for years, and who had, Nan confirmed, been quietly consulted by Constance herself under a promise of the strictest confidence some weeks prior. Marianne did not ask him to break that confidence outright. She asked him only, carefully, whether a physician's duty to a patient's health could ever be weighed against a duty to prevent a greater harm, the ruin by false accusation of an innocent man, and left the question with him to turn over in his own conscience, trusting, rightly, as it happened, that a good man given an honest choice will very often choose the harder, better path. She had, by the end of that week, gathered letters, ledgers, and the quiet promise of a physician's testimony, enough, Nan judged, to bring the whole edifice down, if only they could find the moment and the audience to do it in. That moment arrived sooner than either of them expected, and in a setting neither would have chosen, the grand betrothal ball that Lady Beatrice, moving with the swiftness of a woman who sensed her advantage might not hold forever, had contrived to have announced for the following Saturday, an evening on which the Duke of Rothermere, worn down by weeks of engineered proximity and mounting pressure from every side, was to make his intentions toward Constance Ashworth formal before the whole of the county. Marianne learned of the ball's true purpose only 2 days before it was to occur, from Nan, who had it from the housekeeper, who had it from Lady Beatrice's own maid, that Constance, growing desperate as her condition advanced toward the point of undeniable visibility, had pressed her mother to force the matter to a head, and that Lady Beatrice, seeing no reason to delay an advantageous match, had all but promised Rothermere would speak by the evening's end. Whether from genuine sentiment or from a debt of honour he did not yet fully understand, he had been manoeuvred into owing. 2 days, Marianne said, staring at the small trove of evidence spread across Nan's kitchen table, letters, ledgers, a folded note in Dr. Fenn's careful hand that would, God willing, arrive in time. 2 days, and I am not even permitted through the front door of that house any longer. Then you shall go through the door as someone they cannot refuse, Nan said, with a grim and sudden fire in her old eyes, because I did not spend 2 weeks helping you gather truth only to watch it moulder unused in my kitchen while that girl puts a stolen ring on her finger. What Marianne did not yet know, what she would not learn until the very night of the ball itself, when a plain, unmarked carriage arrived at Nan's cottage door, bearing a note sealed with a hawk rising from a coronet, was that the Duke of Rothermere had, in the same fortnight, begun an investigation entirely his own, prompted by the name Thorn and by a growing, gnawing unease about the woman he was being steadily herded toward marrying, and that he had, through channels of his own, uncovered enough of the truth to arrive at that ball already half certain of the deception being practised against him, lacking only the final proof and the courage to act upon it publicly. He had sent his note to Nan's cottage, having learned, through his own quiet inquiries, precisely where the dismissed seamstress had gone, not to summon her as a servant, but to ask her, as plainly and humbly as a duke has ever asked anything of anyone, whether she would come to the ball that night and stand beside him when the truth was finally told, because he found, when he considered the matter honestly, that he did not wish to face it without her. Rothermere Hall had never, in Marianne's brief and vanished glimpses of high society, seemed so vast as it did that Saturday evening, blazing with candlelight in every window, carriages queued 3 deep along the drive, the whole county turned out in silk and jewels to witness what they believed would be a duke's happy announcement. She arrived, at Nan's insistence, and in a gown Nan had somehow contrived to make presentable from a length of grey silk and considerable determination, not through the grand front entrance, but through a side door Rothermere himself had arranged to be left unwatched, and found him waiting for her in a small antechamber just off the great hall, dressed in the formal black of the evening, his face pale and set with a tension she recognized, because she had felt its twin in her own chest for a fortnight. "You came," he said, and the relief in his voice was so plain, so entirely without the guardedness she had first met him wearing, that she nearly wept from the sheer unfamiliar comfort of being wanted rather than merely tolerated. "I have proof," she said instead, because there was no time now for anything gentler, and set the small bundle of letters and ledgers into his hands, of the child, of Mr. Thorn, of what was done to my father and what is being attempted against you." He read swiftly, his jaw tightening with every line, and when he looked up at her at last, something in his face had gone very hard and very clear. The look of a man who has finally been handed the weapon he needs to defend not only himself, but everyone who has been wronged alongside him. "They mean to announce it tonight," he said, "before the whole county. My aunt has already spoken to half the room as though the thing was settled. Then it must be undone before the same audience that was meant to seal it," Marianne said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Let them see the truth as publicly as they meant to bury it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither had words for yet. Not quite a promise, not quite a question, but the shape of both waiting to be spoken, and then he offered her his arm, and said, "Then let us go and undo it together," and led her toward the great hall, toward the blazing candlelight and the assembled county, and the reckoning that had in truth been building since a wet October night when a girl had opened a kitchen door and asked nothing of the stranger she let in, but that he come in out of the rain. The great hall of Rothermere fell silent by degrees, the way a pond stills when a stone has already struck the water and the ripples are only now reaching the shore. First the small clusters nearest the door, who saw the Duke enter with an unknown woman on his arm rather than his betrothed, then the musicians whose bows faltered mid-phrase, then the whole glittering assembly, 300 strong, turning as one toward the dais where Lady Beatrice stood with Constance beside her, the sapphire ring already glinting on her finger, though the formal offer had not yet technically been spoken aloud. "Your Grace." Lady Beatrice recovered first, sweeping forward with a smile stretched thin over sudden alarm. "We had not expected, that is, the seamstress. Surely there has been there has been a great deal of something, Lady Beatrice," Rothermere said, and his voice, pitched to carry without seeming to strain for it, filled the enormous room the way only a voice long trained to command could. "I find I owe this company an explanation, and I find I owe it before matters proceed any further." Constance had gone very pale, one hand moving unconsciously to rest against her own waist before she caught herself and let it fall. "Alaric," she began, low, urgent, for his ears alone, "whatever she has told you, she has told me nothing that Mr. Thorne's own letters do not confirm rather more thoroughly," he said, not unkindly, but without mercy either, and drew from his coat the small bundle Marianne had given him, holding it up not to read from but simply to be seen, a tangible fact in a room built on the assumption that no such fact existed. "I am given to understand, Lady Constance, that congratulations are somewhat premature, not for a betrothal, but for an event some months hence, the father of which is not myself." The silence that followed was the particular silence of 300 people forgetting simultaneously to breathe. This is monstrous. Lady Beatrice's voice cracked upward, shrill, reaching for outrage before the room's judgment could settle anywhere but where she directed it. "A jealous servant's lies, Your Grace, nothing more. A girl dismissed from this house for theft, seeking to. I was accused of theft the same week I overheard your daughter and Mr. Thorne discussing how best to force his Grace's hand," Marianne said, and her own voice, when it came, surprised her with how little it shook. "And I have wondered since whether the timing of one accusation and the necessity of the other were entirely unconnected." She turned, not to Lady Beatrice, but to the room at large, because Nan had taught her in their 2 weeks of hurried preparation that a truth spoken to an audience is far harder to smother than a truth whispered to a single accuser. I do not ask any of you to take my word alone. I ask only that you hear what Mr. Thorne himself has written in his own hand to Lady Constance, regarding the necessity of ensuring, in his own words, that whatever must be explained points toward his grace and nowhere else. It was at this precise moment that Julian Thorne, who had been standing near the refreshment table in the particular complacent ease of a man who believes his schemes still concealed, understood that the ground beneath him had already given way, and made the fatal error of trying to run rather than brazen the matter through, a movement toward the side door that drew every eye in the room and confirmed, more thoroughly than any letter could have, precisely where guilt truly lay. He did not get far. Rothermere had, with characteristic foresight, stationed 2 of his own men at every exit the moment he understood what the evening would require, and Thorne was brought back into the centre of the hall white-faced and blustering, still attempting denials that grew visibly thinner with every word. "There is more," Rothermere said once Thorne had been secured, and his voice had gone colder now, the coldness not of cruelty but of a man laying out facts he finds it costs him something to speak aloud. Mr. Thorne's history of theft did not begin with this deception. Some 3 years past, he defrauded a modest and honest gentleman of trade, Mr. Thaddeus Hale, of nearly the whole of his fortune, through falsified accounts I have here in copy, obtained from Mr. Thorne's own former clerk. Missy, Hale died believing himself, and leaving his only daughter ruined through some failure of his own judgment. He was not ruined by his own judgment. He was ruined by the same man who has spent this autumn attempting to ruin me by an entirely similar means. He looked at last directly at Marianne, and something in his face softened even as the rest of the room watched, transfixed. I believe this company owes Miss Hale an apology considerably larger than the one it has, until this moment, imagined it owed her. Dr. Fenn, who had slipped quietly into the hall some minutes before and stood near the back throughout, chose that moment to step forward, his face grave, and confirmed in the measured terms of a man who has wrestled his conscience to a decision and will not now retreat from it, that he had indeed attended Lady Constance in recent weeks, and that the timing of her condition laid plainly against the record of the Duke's own known movements and absences that autumn, made his paternity a physical impossibility rather than merely an unlikelihood. Constance did not attempt, after that, to sustain the fiction any further. She sank into a chair someone hastily provided, weeping, whether from genuine distress or from the collapse of a scheme she had never wholly wanted but had lacked the courage to refuse. Marianne could not have said and found, watching her, that she felt less triumph than a kind of tired pity. The particular exhaustion of watching cruelty finally answered, rather than the satisfaction she had half expected to feel. It was Lady Beatrice who made the final fatal misstep, turning on her daughter with a viciousness that stripped away, in front of the entire county, whatever pretence of maternal feeling had ever draped her ambition. Hissing accusations of stupidity and ruin loud enough to carry to every corner of the silent hall, and it was that moment, more than any letter or ledger, that finally and completely turned the assembled company's sympathy, ending any lingering doubt among the onlookers about which women in that room had acted with true cruelty, and which had simply, for a long time, endured it. Rothermere let the scene play out only a moment longer before he moved, and when he moved, He moved with the particular decisiveness of a man who has spent 6 years learning to distrust every gesture made toward him and has finally, gratefully, found one he does not have to doubt. He crossed to where Constance sat, and with a gentleness that surprised those who expected fury, said only, "I release you from any claim upon me, Lady Constance, and I do not intend to pursue the matter of the deception publicly beyond what has already been said tonight, provided Mr. Thorne answers properly for his fraud before a magistrate, as he shall." Then, without further ceremony, he reached down and drew the sapphire ring from her unresisting finger, the ring that had been meant, an hour before, to seal a lie, and turned and crossed the width of that vast silent hall to where Marianne stood, and went down on one knee before the entire assembled county of witnesses who had not 1 hour earlier watched a seamstress be accused of theft in this very house. "I have spent 6 years believing that no one could want anything from me but what my title could purchase them," he said, and his voice, though quiet now, carried in the perfect silence to every corner of the room, until a girl opened a kitchen door on a wet night and asked nothing of me at all. "I do not offer you this ring because it is available, Miss Hale. I offer it because I have not in 6 years wanted anything the way I want you to wear it." He did not press the sapphire upon her, he set it aside entirely, and drew instead, from his own hand, the heavy old signet that bore his father's crest, the very ring he had once shown her by grey morning light, and held it out instead, a plainer thing, but the one that was truly his to give. Marianne, who had buried a father, endured 3 years of quiet contempt, and spent a fortnight gathering evidence by candlelight to save a man she had not been at all certain still wanted saving, found that she could not for a long moment speak at all, and answered him instead the only way that felt true, by kneeling to meet him, there on the ballroom floor before 300 witnesses, and saying yes with a steadiness that surprised no one so much as herself. The magistrate, Sir Edmund Cole, who had been among the guests that evening, and had watched the whole affair unfold with the particular satisfaction of a man seeing justice arrive by an unusually theatrical route, took Julian Thorne into custody before the night was finished, and within the month the full accounting of his fraud against both the Hale estate and, in smaller measure, 2 other families in the county who had trusted him with their affairs over the years, was laid bare in a proceeding that restored to Marianne, if not the whole of what her father had lost, at least the clear and public knowledge that he had died an honest man, ruined by another's dishonesty and not his own failing. Lady Beatrice and Constance withdrew from society for the better part of a year, and if the county's sympathy toward Constance herself softened somewhat in time, she had, after all, been more foolish and frightened than truly wicked, a young woman manoeuvred by a mother's ambition and a scoundrel's charm into a scheme she had lacked the courage to refuse. No one ever again mistook Lady Beatrice for anything other than what that ballroom evening had revealed her to be. Marianne Hale became, within the season, the Duchess of Rothermere, and those who had once watched her kneel on cold floors with pins between her lips now watched her preside over the same great hall with a warmth that made the house, for the first time in years, feel less like a monument to consequence and more like an actual home. She kept old Nan Pratt near her always, installed in comfort and consulted on every matter of household management the young Duchess considered worth a wise old woman's opinion, and she never forgot, in all the years of plenty that followed, what it had cost to be poor and disbelieved, which was perhaps why the tenants and servants of Rothermere came to speak of their new duchess, not merely with respect, but with the particular devoted fondness reserved for those in power who have not forgotten what it felt like to have none. Alaric Vane, for his part, discovered that a title need not curdle every kindness offered to its holder after all, so long as the one offering it wanted nothing from him but the plain, unpurchased fact of his company. And he made certain, every anniversary of that wet October evening, to have a fire banked high, and a cup of something hot waiting. A small private ritual between the two of them that no ballroom finery could ever quite equal. And so the girl who had once been told to mind the pins and keep silent came to speak, at last, with a voice the whole county had learned to listen to, proof enough, if any were needed, that a kindness given freely, with no thought of what it might purchase, has a way of returning, in its own good time, as the very thing that saves us.